and the Sigur Center for Asian Studies at the George Washington University, Washington, DC, I, Simi Mehta, welcome one and all to what is going to be an enthralling session on border disputes in Sino-Indian relations, past, present, and prospects. Border disputes between India and China is not new. In fact, there have been several skirmishes between the two countries in the past. However, the most recent confrontation between the Indian Army and the Chinese People's Liberation Army created a blot in the almost peaceful coexistence wherein no Indian soldier was killed at the hands of the Chinese in the past 4.5 decades. Since April this year, things have been a little different. The entire stretch along the line of actual control in the Ladakh region has witnessed a worrisome hardening of Chinese positions. There has been a mutual understanding between the two nuclear-armed nations, neighbors actually, that their troops will not use firearms in the contested and inhospitable Himalayan region. But the latest standoff shows a considerable shift. Previous incidences of pushing and punching gave way to the use of sharp stones, use of baseball bats barbed with wires and nails from the Chinese side against the Indian army, and that too after the sundown. Postmortem reports of at least 15 martyred Indian soldiers showed the cause of death as a mix of head injury, severe bruises, and drowning, as their bodies were recovered from the Galwan River. In fact, this time, China has sought to interfere with the status quo, and the theater of military tension includes the Galwan Valley, Demchok, Daulat Beg Oldie, Hot Springs, Four Fingers at Pangong So, and the Nathula. There are several dimensions to the border disputes between India and China, and today's webinar would seek to address this. I'm excited to introduce to you the expert panelists for today's discussion. We are extremely fortunate to have Ambassador Nirupama Rao, who is one of India's best known diplomats. She joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1973, and during her four-decade-long diplomatic career, she has held several important assignments. Madam was India's first woman spokesperson at the Ministry of External Affairs, New Delhi. She was first Indian woman High Commissioner to Sri Lanka and first Indian woman ambassador to People's Republic of China. Ambassador Rao was India's Foreign Secretary from 2009 to 11 and India's ambassador to the United States from 2011 to 13. Post-retirement from active diplomatic service, she entered into the academic world and has been a fellow at several universities like the Brown University at Rhode Island, the New School at New York, University of California, San Diego, as well as in the Wilson Center, Washington, DC. Ambassador Rao has received several awards and recognitions and was also listed among the 100 most influential women on Twitter in 2012 by foreignpolicy.com. Ambassador Rao is currently completing her book on the diplomatic history of India-China relations between 1949 to 62. Thank you very much, Ambassador Rao, for joining us. We are delighted to be joined by Dr. Kyle Gardner, a non-resident fellow at the Sigur Center for Asian Studies at the George Washington University. He's also an associate at the McLarty Associates, a strategic advisory firm. Kyle holds a PhD in South Asian and International History from University of Chicago and received a distinction for his dissertation on the history of Sino-Indian border disputes. His first book, The Frontier Complex, Geopolitics and the Making of India-China Border, 1846 to 1962, is forthcoming with the Cambridge University Press. Thank you, Kyle, for joining us and for your proactive support. We are delighted to have with us Dr. Anit Mukherjee, who is the Deputy Head of Graduate Study and the Assistant Professor in the South Asian Program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. He holds a PhD from the School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, Johns Hopkins University, and a postdoctorate from the Center for Advanced Study of India, University of Pennsylvania. He has been affiliated with the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, IDSA, in New Delhi, Brookings Institution, and Rand Corporation. He continues to be a resident visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania and Brookings, India. He is the author of the book, The Absent Dialogue, Politicians, Bureaucrats, and the Military in India, published by the Oxford University Press in 2019. His articles have been published in the New York Times, Indian Express, Journal of Strategic Studies, and several others. He has also served in the Indian Army. Thank you so much, Anit, for joining us today. And finally, we have Dr. Deep Pal. Thank you, Dr. Deep Pal, for joining us. Dr. Deep holds a PhD from the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. He's a non-resident fellow at the National Bureau of Asian Research. He holds a master's degree in international affairs from the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University and has worked with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, at Washington, DC, and also at the Institute of International Relations, Taipei, in Taiwan. Deep is an experienced broadcast journalist and has worked for the most watched TV stations in India, including Times Now, Aaj Tak, CNBC Awaaz, etc. Dr. Pal has specialized in the study of the complex dynamics guiding the Sino-Indian relationship since the mid-20th century. He's an avid writer and frequently contributes to publications such as Foreign Policy, China Brief, The Diplomat, The Wire, Life Mint, etc. So with this, we now come to the moment we have all been eagerly waiting for. I would request the respected panelists to make their opening remarks for about 7 to 8 minutes, following which we'll have some time for an interaction between the panelists, and then we move on to the question and answers, and then conclude by the vote of thanks. On a side note, I also request the participants to use the chat box to write their questions and identify the panelists to whom the question is posed. Thank you very much. I invite Dr. Kyle Gardner to make his opening remarks. Kyle, over to you.
Thanks, Simi, and thanks to my co-panelists and the team at IMPRI for organizing this event. Very much looking forward to the discussion and honored to be a part of such a distinguished panel. Given the expertise of my co-panelists, I think I can probably best start this conversation off by providing some of the deeper historical context to the border dispute to help shape our discussion. And I think these fall under two broad historical points. The first concerning missing borders, and the second concerning the complications brought about by the legal continuity of states. You know, often it's the historian's role in conversations on current events to say something to the effect of, it's complicated and it's more complicated than you think. But actually, at least at the root of the Sino-Indian border dispute is a fairly simple problem. And that is that for much of the Sino-Indian border, there isn't a border. There's not a mutually agreed to demarcated border. And so while events like the tragic violence in the Galwan Valley 2 weeks ago, you know, will raise questions about whether this or that lies on one side or the other of the line of control, the bigger issue still remains, and one which goes back well before 1962 and well before 1947, is that there simply has never been an accepted border in the Western sector, which I take it we'll likely focus on today, but also in the Eastern sector as well. And this brings in and is largely the fault of a third actor, no longer present, but still very much here, and that is the British Empire. The British Empire spent over a century attempting to determine a border in Ladakh, and did so through developing boundary-making principles, surveying, building roads, mapping, And this was driven largely by the concern of avoiding Russian encroachment. Secondarily, also concerns over the Qing Empire, but for the British in the 19th century, the primary geopolitical concern was that of Russia, and they did so and addressed Russian encroachment through attempts to map borders, but also create buffer states to help, as best they could, insulate British India. And in the process, the Ladakh, which was historically a crossroads, really found itself increasingly in the role of a frontier. Now, as to give just a sort of 30-second backstory to the history of Ladakh here, I'm sure many of you know this, but Ladakh was conquered in 1834 by the Dogra Raja of Jammu, Gulab Singh, who was later given Kashmir by the British East India Company following the defeat of the Sikh Empire. And immediately in 1846, the British set about establishing boundary commissions in an attempt to start to demarcate a border and map it. And the commissioners were tasked with using the water partings, the limits of the watersheds in the region as lines that could be seemingly straightforward to map and were unlikely to produce disputes. But as the more surveying that they did, the more complex things got. And this was really a process that went on and on. And partly this was because Ladakh, for all of its history, never had historical border lines. It didn't really need them. It's a region surrounded by passes. In fact, the name itself, Ladakh, means land of passes. And so the need for border lines really came into play only when the region's rulers needed to present a map to show to other potentially encroaching empires that this is our line. Now, surveys, particularly one done in 1865, generated maps of pretty substantial confusion. And this continued up into 1947, which brings me to the second point about the continuity of claims by prior states, which complicate things. Chinese claims go back to the period of the Republic of China. They go back to the Qing Empire, and they're further complicated by the historically ambiguous status of Tibet. Similarly, Indian claims go through British India, its many princely states, and in the case of the now sort of doubly erstwhile princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, you have Ladakh, which itself, as I mentioned, never really had historical border lines, although did have border points. So this, while India quickly reshaped itself after its hard-won independence in 47, the colonial legacy here really did endure, both in the Western sector and the Northeastern, or the Eastern sector. And I think a lot of the practices that the colonial government established are still seen today in the form of road making and surveying and restricted access to sensitive border regions. So there is a very active colonial legacy still playing out here, and one that that I think is important to make note as we move forward and think about maybe what can in fact be done from a policy perspective. So I'll leave it with that. I'm also happy to weigh in on more recent historical events, but I think that one of the aspects that's often missing from debates on the border dispute is precisely just how far back these issues go and the time scale here. So, and as any historian can tell you, that gets pretty complicated.
Sure, thank you. Am I audible? Yeah, okay, great. So thank you very much, Kylie, for your initial remarks. Now I would request Dr. Deep to go on and take the stage and make your inaugural comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Simi. It's great to be here with Ambassador Rao and Anit as well as Kyle. And thank you for having us in this very topical and timely webinar. So my comments are going to be looking at three basic points. I'll be starting at looking at what is happening at the LSE and the Galwan issue and all of this. I'll try to frame it more in terms of how this fits into China's global ambitions. From that, I will come and look into what this means for the region, for South Asia, for India's immediate neighborhood. Excuse me. And finally, I will try and give out a couple of pointers on what this means for India. So the first point, as far as understanding the LSE or what happened at Galwan or what is happening at Pangong, so or the other places where there is currently some form of a standoff between the PLA and the Indian Armed Forces that is going on. What we need to understand is how this fits into China's global ambitions. Now, there is a tendency to look at this from the Indian standpoint as a sui generis event. And I think that there is a mistake if we look at it only as this. Now, if we go back into how China sees itself or how it articulates its position in the world, there are a couple of these goals that were articulated some years ago when Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. Soon after that, he talked about something called the 2 centenary goals, which basically they form the basic foundation of his legacy and for achieving something that they call the China dream or the Chinese dream. It's an ideology that was advanced by Xi Jinping right at the outset. Now, the first centenary goal envisages PRC emerging as a moderately prosperous or a Xiaokang society by 2021, which is next year, and also the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, this and the second centenary refers to the centenary of the PRC, which is in 2049, by which China, they expect, will be a strong, democratic, civilized, harmonious, and modern socialist country. Now, 2021 is next year, and there are these certain goals that Xi Jinping expects or has to deliver to the Chinese people by next year, which will involve being moderately prosperous. And however, if you look at what has been happening in China, both internally as well as externally, the entire coronavirus pandemic has obviously affected the economy to a point where prosperity, at least of the kind that they have been used to with economic growth in the last 30 years or so, is not something that is very easily sustainable. Additionally, it is possibly fair to say that today China is has been cornered by a number of countries, more countries than any time in the recent past, over their role in the pandemic. And as all of these things happen, China can see itself in various kinds of trouble. And the entire question of reaching the first centenary goal next year becomes questionable. So what we see happening in China right now, or on the LSE right now, is a part of this broader canvas. We are seeing China have a number of issues with a number of countries, because China right now wants to see this moment when the entire world is distracted by the pandemic as a kind of opportunity to emerge on the global stage as the unquestioned leader. For one, we have seen them open many fronts across the world, right? Usually we have seen China concentrate on 1 or 2 fronts, which is not something that we're seeing right now. Apart from the issues with India, we are seeing them having issues with Canada, with Japan, with the national security legislature in Hong Kong. We are seeing them have issues with Taiwan. And above all, we are seeing relations with the United States come to a point where we have not seen them to be there in the last many, many years. Now, along with this, there is also this understanding that China sees the United States as firmly in retreat in the international arena, which leaves a kind of a strategic vacuum with which the PRC believes that it is ready to occupy at this point in time. We have seen the US most recently retreat from the WHO, and China is advancing its own model of a kind of a multilateral arrangement in the form of the Health Silk Road that will take over that point in time. So this is largely what the global ambition, the Chinese global ambitions look like right now. Now, as far as India's neighborhood is concerned, this basically means that we will see China spread itself far across India's neighborhood, far more than it has so far. Now, over the last few years, we have seen China build close relations with all of India's neighbors. We have seen them with build relations with Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Pakistan, of course. And one large part of this has been the BRI, but also otherwise they have started being closer to these various states. Now, that basically means that in future incidents between India and China, it is possible that we will see the neighbors also involved in some ways or the other. It will possibly be in ways that India will not like. We have heard the Chief of Army Staff recently talk about how Nepal's issue with the entire Kalapani issue may have had someone else behind them. Whether or not that is correct, whether or not that is the case is immaterial, but there is a growing perception that China will want to be present in all of these countries and the various kinds of decisions that they make increasingly. Now, the problem with that is India may not like this, but there is very little that India can do in these various sovereign entities expressing their right to have options in their internal as well as external issues. Now, what does this mean for India? The first thing that we must understand is that the India-China relationship has irrevocably changed after the incidents in Galwan in June 15-16. Now, we saw over the last 30 years or so, a whole host of measures being put into place since former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's visit to Beijing in 1988. I'm sure Ambassador Menon will talk about that at some point. She also visited Beijing at that time. But the rapprochement that we saw come about as a result of that, which also brought about a number of agreements and confidence building measures between 1993 and 2013. All of these are basically under question right now, because what we are seeing happen in Galwan, what has happened at the LSE already, brings about a very basic trust deficit, which questions every move between the two parties. The same goes for the special representative level talks for settling the boundary question that have been going on, which have had over 22 rounds of talks at this point in time, but they will also be under question right now. It also means that India will have to, at some point, take a decision on whether or not they want to tiptoe around China, give the idea that India is not interested in encircling China in any way, because clearly that is not something that China has believed so far. Now, this is a time when Indian policymakers will have to look around the world and possibly strengthen partnerships, which may have already started with bringing Australia into the Malabar exercise. There will have to be a lot of other permutations and combinations that Indian policy members will have to look at right now. As far as the boundary question is concerned, it is unlikely to be solved anytime soon. China has so far not seen any benefit in resolving this. They have possibly thought of this as a counter to their perception of India meddling in the Tibet issue or in the Dalai Lama issue. And they have not resolved it so they have shown no interest in resolving it so far. What they might want to do after this is basically try and resolve it in a way in which it works to their advantage. For example, today take Aksai Chin, tomorrow ask for Tawang, and so on and so forth. which basically would be their version of thinking that this essentially undercuts the possibility of any kind of Indian meddling in the Dalai Lama issue or in the Tibet issue in future. So I'm going to stop with that for the time being, and I'm happy to take forward any of the issues that I have brought up further on. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Deep, for your insightful comments. I invite Dr. Anit Mukherjee to make his inaugural comments.
Thank you so much, Simi. It is good to be here. Firstly, I apologize for the Zoom background. I had a bet with my son and I lost the bet and I had to put up the Toy Story thing as a Zoom background. I mean, I didn't know that Pluto is no longer considered a planet. So I don't know the things which are occurring in the world these days. Pluto, as I was growing up, it is a planet. It's not one anymore. So I apologize about the Zoom background. I'm not an expert on China. And although I've read a lot of the WhatsApp forwards, and if we go by the public discourse in India, that should kind of qualify me as an expert on China. I think 6 weeks ago, I was an expert on the COVID epidemic because I read a lot of WhatsApp forwards too. Before that, I was an expert on race issues all over the world because, again, a lot of WhatsApp forward. But again, I say this as a person that I'm not an expert on that country. So I'm going to keep, and I'm not going to talk about the tactical picture on the ground because I think there's a lot of speculation about the tactical picture that is happening on the ground, and it's still extremely unclear. But I'm going to do, which is I'm going to ask a little bit of questions about the issue that I think we need to think about. And I have prepared a PowerPoint. I'm not sure if I can share it though. Is there a way to share the PowerPoint? No, I should have told you about that before, Simi. But anyway, okay, I'll go ahead. I just tried to share it and I was told that it's being disabled. Oh, wait.
Yes, we can have that.
Yes.
Anshula,
So,
if you could just make Anit the co-host, he'll be able to share his screen.
thank you so much. I should have
I've enabled the screen share.
Yes.
So let me start with the first question, which is the what question, right? Which is what is happening? The first thing that I think we need to admit upfront is there's been a change of status quo by China, right? For a long time, the discussion, at least in April and May, was, has anything changed? What we know now is decisively is China did change the status quo. They changed it primarily by large-scale deployment of troops. And I'm not going to get into the controversy right now about Galwan Valley, if they have occupied Patrol Point 14 or not. But as we speak, there is a speculation if we still have access to PP14. As we speak, there's still controversies about do we have access to the Finger 8 area, which was sort of disputed. I do not know enough about the facts on the ground if we can claim some sort of control or over the area from Finger 4 to Finger 8. But questions are being asked about unilateral Chinese decisions to change the facts on the ground by deploying troops and constructing bunkers, which is what triggered this crisis off. So that is the big what question. And then, as we are all aware, there was the clash on June 15th, on the night of June 15th, in which we lost 20 soldiers. We are still uncertain about the number of people that they have lost. But it was the first time we had a bloody border since 1975. So I think it was a knock on the complacency which had set into this sort of, that it is just about fisticuffs, because it was completely unexpected. I don't think anybody expected it to turn so violent, and it was a nightmare scenario. For a long time, I think those people who have been studying the border have been arguing that, look, if blood is shed, if somebody dies, it will create an emotional pressure that will force both governments to take a more hard stand. And I think from this, we get the big unknown, which is, has China taken over supposed gray zones? Now, again, as I said, I'm not really an expert on the border dispute, but as far as I understand it, there are so-called gray zones, which was claimed by us, not occupied by them, or claimed by them, and we did not occupy it, and that was the so-called buffer. But what seems to have happened, at least in 2 places now, in the Galwan and perhaps even in the Pangong Lake area. And again, I say this with all about perhaps, right? Because I do not know the tactical picture on the ground, is that China has supposedly made unilateral changes to the ground situation. So that's the one. Second was the why question, right? Which is the why question that a lot of people have been sort of debating over. Deep just spoke about an aspect of the why question. There have been other attempts at answering why has China done so. And there have been arguments about since India changed the administrative arrangement after the revocation of Article 370, it created a lot of turmoil in Beijing, and they did this to send a signal to India. There have been other arguments about infrastructure, that as India has improved its infrastructure, that has created a blowback, so they are doing this to sort of give a fait accompli to the Indian armed forces. Third is about the international image. Deep spoke a little bit about that look, it could be an attempt by China to permanently show itself as the Asian hegemon. Fourth is perhaps this could be also a factor of domestic turmoil within Chinese politics, right? There have been a bit of speculation that look, there is some sort of a domestic turmoil, and this is the best time for people to create an external crisis so that people will go around the flag. And fifth is Xi Jinping, which is, those people who say that China is an expansionist country is just doing this because it's a part of it being evil. And sixth is etc. You could find another reason. There have been all these types of speculations, but why questions are inherently difficult to answer. So I have kept sixth as etc. because perhaps we will have another explanation day after tomorrow, because why questions inherently, they're important to answer. I mean, I'm not saying we should not try to attempt the why question, but inherently the why questions are difficult to answer because just to give an example, even now historians are still divided about the exact causes for the 1962 war. Some people say it was India's Tibet policy. Some people say it was India's alignment with the US. Some people say it was domestic turmoil in China. And I do not think even if somebody does something, they really will give the real underlying reasons why they're doing it. So although I completely accept that it's an important question to take on, I also think it's a very difficult question at this point of time. Perhaps the why would be known or would have been communicated to the most senior officials in India. But in the public domain, so far as we know, we are not very clear. So third is, how should India respond? Right? So we have the what happened, the why happened, and I'm not very clear about the why. I don't think anybody can be at this point of time with the facts that we have on the ground. And the third is, how do we respond? This first aspect of it is the military response. Now this gets people either excited because they want fighting to break out, or it causes concern among people because they don't want fighting to break out. So in terms of what India should do in terms of the armed forces, there are three clear-cut options. One is use force to restore the status quo, right? Which is what you use the armed forces for. They are trained for the job, they are prepared for the job. So just to put down the line and say, we are going to use force to restore the status quo. What this looks like is highly uncertain. Do we break the agreement to not open fire? How do you throw out the Chinese troops from the already occupied positions? Will it cause escalation? Will it cause violence? So all those are uncertainties. Two is do a tit for tat operation, which is do unto them as they have done unto us, which is perhaps try and consolidate facts on the ground where it is disputed or it is not controlled. Except I don't know enough about terrain and tactics and deployment to actually say if this is even a viable option. Three is to maintain the status quo and just go with the assumption that this is going to be a crisis with a long duration, which is this is going to play out over a long time. It is not going to play out over our TV screens tomorrow or next week or next month, but this could be a multi-year deployment, right? This is a long struggle. So that is the three options that I think we can use about the use of force. Beyond that, I've clubbed the two other options. One is diplomatic and strategic. Diplomatically, as Deep has insinuated, is this sort of a very significant turning point in India-China relations? Are the previous agreements that we have on the border agreement of, this is the way forward to solve it, are they null and void? And there have been some ex-MEA officials saying this is a breach of trust. This is not how we we thought it would go, and this could be a watershed in India. And you have seen arguments about that there's an entire generation of Indians who are growing up to again think of China as an enemy. And so that was the diplomatic aspect. What about the strategic aspect? Will India drop its hesitation around strategic autonomy, right? About this thing of, oh, we are not in the great game, we are friends with everybody, or should India more strongly take a leading role in if not helping build anti-China bloc, but also say to China, look, there are strategic costs to your tactical actions. That you might think you might gain 100 meters in the Galwan Valley, or you might gain 4 fingers of the Pangong Lake, but there are strategic and diplomatic costs for that action that would be sort of visited upon you in terms of how we think about engaging with you. So India has to raise the stakes here. I'll end with the last slide, which is the larger questions. So not in my personal life, but professionally, and as someone who has examined organizations, I love crises because I think crises are enablers of change. And we've seen that with India's economic crisis in 91. I studied that with the 1999 Kargil War, where I saw that there was an entire amount of discourse before the Kargil War about how India needs to reform its military, about its Ministry of Defense, about its structures, and there was an entire debate that I saw that was happening for the last 10 years before 1999. And it took the Kargil War for us to actually say, let's create the Kargil Review Committee, let's create the group of ministers report that made some changes. In the same way, it took the 2008 attacks in Mumbai for us to create an NIA. I would like to hope as a citizen, it's my wish that we use this crisis, so as to speak, to actually look deeper at what are the changes that we need to bring about to actually match with this two-front threat. Because there's been a lot of, we have to match this two-front threat. But I think in terms of really, putting it as a national effort, we need to do a lot much more. And what does a lot much more look like? I'm going to take a couple of guesses. First is there's been this perennial complaint about systemic deficiencies. Among the things that was unusual about the LSE, I thought, and this was something that was made clear, very clear after the 2008 GOM report, they said one border, one force. The one border, one force, as I understand it, and I could be incorrect, in the LSE was the ITBP. And one of the complaints is that the ITBP and the army does not, I mean, they get along well on the ground, I'm sure tactically level, but does it create, let's say, information asymmetries? ITBP is under MHA, army is under MOD. How is this transference happening? I don't know. But there have been complaints from army officers that that's probably not the best way to go about doing it. This is not the time for finger pointing. I completely accept the point. This is the time to actually face the crisis. But also at some point of time, we need to ask deeper structural questions about how we have been operating and whether we could have done something to prevent this crisis from happening in the first place. I'll give another example. We talk about the infrastructure development. To give this government its credit, since 2014, according to a lot of the reports, they have significantly enhanced infrastructure development along the border areas. The question kind of needs to be asked, could that not have been done after 2000? Can we again take a really dispassionate look at how much was the road construction that was going on from 2000 to 2014? How many kilometers a day? Did we not pay attention to that issue back in the day? If not, why not? Was there other concerns? What were the concerns? And again, I say this without pointing a finger at anyone. I say this because I think it needs to be addressed. Thirdly is the military's own internal capabilities, right? I mean, among the questions that needs to be asked is, if you look at the Chinese deployment, they can bring light tanks on the ground. We have heavy MBT tanks. Has anybody really thought about, should we get a brigade of tanks that can actually operate well in that particular region, in that particular terrain, in that particular altitude, which is not heavy tanks? Is this even a factor? I'm taking a wild guess. But is this even a factor that we should think about? Also, I think even in terms of, if you look at the Indian Armed Forces, there's been a really decline in how much we are spending on the Indian military. And even if you look at the expenses, 28% of them are taken up on pensions. 32 of them on wages. We cannot modernize the military if more than 50% of your budget is taken up by manpower costs. And something has to be done about the pension bill. And I think if you have to make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs. Now, this government tried to do it by creating a CDS and a DMA, but that happened as late as December last year, right? So they are faced with its first wake-up crisis. This should have happened perhaps midway through the first term of the Modi government. Perhaps it's a little too late. Lastly, is a more of an emphasis on how well do we know China. I think our obsession with Pakistan has made us sort of turn away from the problem / danger / challenge posed by Pakistan, of China. Now there's a new generation of scholars of coming up. Deep is there, others are there who actually have done some work. We as a government need to embrace this, create facilitating conditions. We need to ensure that at least our armed forces also are able to go outside the country to spend time in, schools of international relations. I say this because I've had personal experience where there have been proposals for people from the Indian Armed Forces to actually attend schools of international studies, and the MEA or the MOD has not approved it. For some reason, I think there's sister service jealousy, but I think this is counterproductive. And I've had students who are PA officers. I've had students who are officers from the Japanese Armed Forces, the US Armed Forces. And I think, at some point of time, if India wants to be a global growing power, then it needs to have its people grow a bigger mindset. And this idea that, going outside the country to learn about India's Act East policy, which better place to learn about India's Act East policy than to be in Southeast Asia? So I think we need to sort of create an intellectual we need to change the way we think about how we think about China. And I think here's where I would leave at the last point is, do we need a committee of inquiry? Not now, because now we have a crisis at the gates. We don't want the government to get distracted with a committee of inquiry. But at some point of time, all these systemic issues perhaps needs a much more deeper, dispassionate analysis. And I would argue, based on my sort of own work, is existing bureaucracies really find it hard to do so because they're too attached to the status quo. And again, as I said, to make an omelet, you have to break some eggs. And I think we need at some point of time in the next 2 or 3 months to create a committee that can look at this whole host of issues and then think about the way ahead so that we can prepare for the next challenge that comes our way from region. I'll end it here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Anit, for your wonderful remarks and for instilling amongst all of us in the audience with a number of food for thought. I'm sure there are a lot of questions that are coming up for you. Well, thank you very much. I now invite Ambassador Nirupama Rao to share her comments and thoughts. Madam, over to you.
Thank you, Simi. It's wonderful to share this platform with so many eminent scholars of a new generation. I belong to an older generation. I've been around working on China since the mid-80s, which is a long time. And I may sound a little dated, so you will have to cut me some slack on that count. But what happened in Galwan, the face-off and the tragic fallout of that face-off on the 15th of June, has been called by many as a turning point in India-China relations. And it's called a turning point, I suppose, because it has, in a sense, put paid to and damaged the whole structure of relations between the two Asian giants, as it were, which had been painstakingly put together at least from 1988, when Rajiv Gandhi, our then Prime Minister, visited China. And Deng Xiaoping, if you remember, called it the Asian century, in which India and China would be the main participants, and that the Asian century would have little meaning if these two countries did not progress and prosper and did not build good relations between themselves. Today, of course, there's very little talk of that Asian century being an India-China century by the Chinese, except, of course, in occasional diplomatic bromides that they issue when you have leadership level meetings, but their actions speak differently. Whatever China has seemed to do in the last few years would suggest that it would like to contain Indian growing power within South Asia. It would like to kind of checkmate our efforts to attain and our aspirations to a larger role on the global stage. And of course, their relationship with Pakistan has been a thorn in the flesh for us. And not more than that, I would suggest, in terms of national security and in terms of the defense of our borders and in terms of our fight against terrorism. On various fronts, I believe that relationship has begun to be more than just, you know, a trend in our neighborhood that we have to keep a watch on. Now, when you look at how the Chinese have reacted to the Galwan face-off, you will see that, you know, they keep talking about India having violated its commitments, that the sovereignty of the Galwan Valley has always been China's, and that Indian troops have seriously violated the agreements between the two countries on border issues. So these statements from China, which are fairly uniform in their content and substance and really don't mince any words, the gloves are obviously off, would suggest that, you know, the Chinese playbook is really to put us on watch about, you know, the situation along the line of actual control, not only in Galwan, but also in other areas. And some Chinese observers like Yun Sun of the Stimson Center in Washington, in a recent article in the War on Rocks online site, talked about India's, you know, infrastructure arms race with China, whatever that meant, because just as the Chinese have improved and consolidated their infrastructure capacity in on their side of the line of actual control and, you know, areas leading into Aksai Chin from Xinjiang and also from the southern side from Tibet and nearer, you know, the patrolling points along the LAC. Similarly, I believe it is perfectly within our rights. We are completely justified in improving our infrastructure capacity in areas close to the line of actual control. But obviously, the Chinese use this as a factor in the situation, which in their you know, interpretation or their proclamation would suggest that has been a cause for tension. Now, the second point I'd like to make is, you know, the border, the agreements and the protocols and the mechanisms that India and China had concluded from 1993 onwards, in 1996, in 2005, 2012, 2013, to maintain peace and tranquility in the areas along the line of actual control and to build confidence. They had worked pretty well, and for 45 years, in fact, even before 1993, from 1975 onwards, you had not encountered a situation similar to what happened in Galwan in any point across the long border and areas along the line of actual control between India and China. There had been transgressions, there had been face-to-face confrontations. The situation in Sundarong-Chu in the Tawang district of Arunachal Pradesh began in 1986 and it dragged on till for about 6 to 7 years, a biblical span as I would call it. But it was diffused ultimately. In fact, that face-off actually led to Rajiv Gandhi visiting China. And then subsequently, you know, by 1993, we were talking of a regime of maintenance of peace and tranquility in the border areas, and such principles as equality and mutual benefit and mutual security, mutual and equal security. I think that's the term that we used. We were using those terms, and obviously they were used with some substance and some meaning to them, not empty words, not bromides. And there was also an agreement from the part of China in the 1996 agreement for confidence building measures, that the two sides, Article 10 of that agreement talked about the verification of the line of actual control between the two sides. In fact, I'm just thinking, yeah, Article 10 talked of speeding up the clarification and confirmation of the line of actual control. So there was actually an understanding between the two sides that they would clarify and confirm the line of actual control. But you know, as you well know, and I think it's been mentioned many times post Galwan, that in 2002, 2003, when the two sides, when the experts sat down to exchange maps to verify the line of actual control, after doing this exercise in the central sector or middle sector of the boundary, when it came to the western sector and the maps were exchanged, the Chinese side withdrew their map in about 20 minutes during that meeting, and there was no further movement after that. Now, why they did so, whether it was there were too large a gap, there was too large a gap between each side's interpretation of where the line lay, or whether it had something to do with you know, the area around Karakoram Pass, where the Chinese had refused really to deal with us for some years now, and that has a lot perhaps to do with the so-called understandings that they've reached with Pakistan on that side, west of the Karakoram Pass, considerably west of the Karakoram Pass, where, as you know, Pakistan illegally ceded territory to China in the Sino-Pak boundary agreement of 1963. So the agreement to clarify the line of actual control really did not get anywhere. And as you can see, it has the differences that have cropped up along the LAC really point to the lack of or the inability of the two sides to jointly clarify this line and to confirm it. Whatever you may say about pockets of differences along the LAC. But the fact is, in Galwan, it goes a little beyond that, in my view. It's not just a question of differences in perception of the LAC, because if you look at the coordinates which were conveyed to the Indian side in 1960 during the official talks between the governments of India and the PRC, we had 3 rounds of talks, as you know, in Beijing, in Delhi, and in Yangon. And each side put forward, you know, their explanations of the basis for their border alignments. And the Chinese actually conveyed to us a set of coordinates about where their claim line, or their so-called boundary, was in the Galwan area. So there are actually a set of coordinates that were given. And if you plot those coordinates on the terrain today, those coordinates render a point that is east, at least 3 to 4 kilometers east of the estuary of the Galwan River and the Shyok River, where the Chinese are claiming now that the LAC is actually located. Now, what does it tell you then about the Chinese, attitude, or the Chinese approach to the maintenance of peace and tranquility along the LAC? It really suggests that their so-called claim line and thereby their interpretation of the LAC is a constantly moving interpretation, and that is an extremely worrisome factor, because it really introduces a new complication, let me say, into the entire playbook of the India-China relationship. So what is to prevent the Chinese from coming forward with a new interpretation of where the LAC lies in other pockets along the LAC in the western sector, and equally alarmingly in other sectors of the India-China border, whether it's the central sector, whether it's the Sikkim sector, whether it's the eastern sector, which, as you know, covers Arunachal Pradesh, which the Chinese call the area of the largest dispute. And from 1985 onwards, they have been saying that India has to make concessions in this area for a border settlement, on the basis of which China will make what they call corresponding concessions in the western sector of the boundary. And this was an attitude that became increasingly pronounced, the salience of which was increasingly pronounced from 1985 onwards, even preceding Sundarong Chu, and the ascent, let me say, of Arunachal Pradesh to the status of a state of the Indian Union from the status of a union territory. So, so today, this is the complexity that presents itself to us. The India-China border, one of the longest land borders in the world, is an unsettled border. And over the decades, the situation has only grown more complicated. And it has firstly to do with the attitude that the Chinese present in the boundary negotiations, and now in treating the situation along the line of actual control by advancing their claims. And of course, today, knocking on everybody's door or on everybody's doorstep is this huge behemoth we call China today, risen, very different, let's say, from 1988 when Rajiv Gandhi went to China and our GDPs, India's and China's, were more or less at the same level. We were roughly similar countries. I recall caravans, I can call them caravans of Chinese experts, making their way to New Delhi saying that we would like to study how you do your audits and accounts. We would like to study what your space program is. We would like to study how your civil service is organized. We want to study your agricultural sector. And I still remember, I'm old enough to remember that. And I see, where they are today. They've obviously made great strides and won, let's be frank, the admiration of the world in the process. But side by side, they've abandoned, as you all know, the 24-character diktat of Deng Xiaoping. And Xi Jinping's China is really, talking about China becoming #1, China being unrelenting about safeguarding and advancing its territorial claims. You see that in the East China Sea, the South China Sea. And now you see that on the land border with India. So it's a very bloated sense of self that China has today. And we have to really, deal with that and craft a strategy that is able to safeguard our interests and also to leverage the equities and the advantages that we have in the region with our friends and partners in order to create, let us say, some degree of resistance, firm resistance, resolute resistance to the advances made by China. I agree that, conflict with China, war with China, prolonged and protracted contest and confrontation with China may not be the best solution for India today. And we have our tasks cut out for us in terms of the transformation of India within, and of course, ensuring a good external balance for us without, so externally. Maybe I need to explain that, unless it might get misunderstood otherwise. So, so this is where we stand, and what do we want? The question is often asked. And before I do that, I wrote briefly some time ago about what are the sources of Chinese conduct in Ladakh today. Now, one, of course, they want to advance their claims and to overlook our strategic assets, especially given the fact that Leh, the capital of Ladakh, is so much in the vicinity of these areas that have now come under threat by increased activity from China. And secondly, of course, a lot of people have spoken about the reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir following the revocation of Article 370 by the government of India in early August 2019, and the kind of Chinese protest that was occasioned as a result. Now, we have, of course, told the Chinese there is really no change as far as the external boundaries of the region are concerned, and that we have not sought in any way to change the status quo as far as dealing with China on these issues is concerned. But they have read the whole reinterpretation, obviously, in their own calculus, in their own scale of how to react to these events. And I think the linkage with Pakistan comes in particularly. It stares us in the face here, because the reorganization of the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir into the Union territories of Jammu and Kashmir and the Union territory of Ladakh. And if you look now at the map of the northernmost part of India, you see that the Union territory of Ladakh occupies a huge area. In fact, the district of Leh today is the second largest district in India after Kutch in Gujarat. I think it's about 45,110 square kilometers, if I'm not mistaken, and it includes it includes the areas of Gilgit, Wazarat, Chilhas, and tribal territory as we defined it in 1947, in addition to the remaining areas of the Leh and Ladakh districts of 1947 after cutting out Kargil, after the carving out of the Kargil district. So obviously, Ladakh has become, essentially our external, let's say on the front line in many ways, with China as far as Aksai Chin is concerned, and of course with Pakistan occupied areas as far as Gilgit-Baltistan and those areas, contiguous areas are concerned. And Gilgit-Baltistan, of course, is that part of Pakistan occupied Kashmir that through which the CPEC, earlier the Karakoram Highway, which China built, runs. And therefore there is a China connection there. And of course you have Aksai Chin. And I still remember from the late 80s when Sundarong Chu was, troubling the relationship, one of the Chinese diplomats telling us we had a lot of heated exchanges, I remember at that time, talking about Aksai Chin and saying, as far as Aksai Chin is concerned, you can say goodbye to Aksai Chin. That's not on the negotiating table, really speaking. Tempers were very high, and words sometimes exchanged at on these occasions can be very weighted, and in many senses they can symbolize what is the hidden attitude or agenda of the other side. And it's very ingrained in my memory, that particular statement. So obviously some complication has arisen. I am not swallowing any Chinese line on this, but I'm trying to interpret what the Chinese conveyed to us in 2019. And the fact today is that as far as China and Pakistan are concerned, the alignment between these two countries and the concordance of interest, even strategic interest, as expressed through the infrastructure build-up in occupied Kashmir and the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, and also, the way China has got Pakistan's back, as it were, on so many issues, whether it's the NSG, whether it's Masood Azhar. China is really Pakistan's iron brother, as it were. And so the question that arises is, if there is confrontation, conflict between India and China in the Western sector, what are China and Pakistan, what tricks do they have up their sleeve, literally? So we have to be concerned about it, because China, to my mind, is walking an increasingly fine line on the India-Pakistan issue. So let's not whistle to keep our courage high. I don't think whistling to keep our courage high is going to work here. We have to take very, very hard-nosed and very clear-eyed, clear-headed analyses we need of how to proceed with the situation ahead. I think the Doklam playbook, we should continue to stand up to China. I don't deny that. We have to be resolute, we have to be firm. But in Doklam, what happened in 2017, exactly 3 years ago, after that 73-day standoff concluded and both sides agreed to disengage, I think the takeaway from that was that we had stood up to the Chinese, and they couldn't, follow up on their agenda of coercive diplomacy with India, because we stood up to them, and there were lessons to be learned from that. But, the Doklam standoff was relatively contained. It took place in a third country. It was in Bhutan, and from both India and China's part, I think, there were lots of eggshells that we were treading on, strategic eggshells, let me say. And we disengaged. We did show a very firm front to China, and China's coercion did not work. But China must have retreated, I think, totally unhappy, I think, with the way things went. And we were, of course, relieved that the tensions had de-escalated and the crisis had been dealt with with conclusions that were very much, I think, to our satisfaction. But that playbook, Chinese playbook, whether it really applies now in the case of our border or our LAC, we cannot be too sanguine about this, because it's 3 years down the line and China is even more emboldened in a coronavirus situation. I think there's a lot of, as I said, a bloated sense of self, of hyper-nationalism, and very, some people call it avant-garde nationalism. There's no other country really has that kind of, nationalism that the Chinese are displaying. And I think on issues of territory all across the board, I think we're dealing with a country that is increasingly unrelenting and doesn't play by any rules. So we're really dealing with some kind of a, it's like, an outlaw riding into town at high noon in one of those old cowboy movies, throwing open the saloon door, shooting down everybody and saying, I'm here and you deal with me. So I think we have to be worried about it, and we have to look at how we can build a stronger external balance with our friends and partners. I'm not saying we need the United States or the Japanese fighting side by side with us, but I think we need to improve our defense capability, our infrastructure, and I think we should, more military exercises that are a show of strength. Bring in the Australians, bring in the Japanese, bring in the Americans, and we already have the Quad. And I think we have to be less subtle and less hesitant about proclaiming where our interests lie and where our alignments are. It's not that we are going to build alliances, but yes, alignments. Yes, we can afford to build multiple alignments. And similarly with Russia, let's not discard that relationship. I think it still has many advantages inbuilt for us. And Russia is a friend of China and India. So I think it occupies a privileged position in that sense. So let's not disregard that relationship. I'm going to stop here because I realize that there should be time for questions and answers. And I believe Dr. Arjun Kumar is also here, so he may want to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Rao. It is always a delight and a pleasure to listen to you, and your expertise and your experience totally adds up to the entire value of the discussion. So I'm sure the audience is loving the program. So thank you again. So what I'll do now is we'll just give a few minutes in case among the panelists, if anybody would like to pose questions or comments to one another, if that is there, or we can just move on to the question answers, where we have a few sets, a couple of sets in fact, of questions, and then they are coming on here on the chat box as well. So anybody who would like to, anybody in the panel, anybody who would like to ask a question to one another?
I have a question.
Yes.
If you don't mind. I'm going to take advantage of this, Ambassador Rao, and ask you this question, which is about the whole ITBP on the LAC border, right? I mean, there's this, there have been kind of complaints from people in the armed forces that having the ITBP deployed there, but under the MHA, it creates too many institutions and too many organizations in charge. So there is the MEA through the China Study Group that works with the military, the ITBP through the MHA. That now I'm sure they all have, but there have been these complaints that the ITBP has its kind of headquarters at Srinagar. They have an advanced kind of, so it creates so-called dissonance. Were you aware of any such discussion of why shouldn't the LAC be given to the army, or was there ever a demand from the army side of, give us the LAC? Thank you.
Thank you, Anit. Not to my knowledge, at least not in my time when I used to attend meetings. But let me say that I have the highest respect both for the Army and the ITBP. And the ITBP, the knowledge and of the terrain and just the intimate knowledge of the mountains and, the fact that they've been policing this frontier from, before the 1962 operations. And going back to the history of what happened on the Konka Pass, as you know, in October 1959. And so that's the genesis. And I've dealt with so many commandants of the ITBP who just you get gobsmacked literally by their knowledge and just the intimate details that they possess about the border areas. So I think that's a national asset that we shouldn't discard at all. And I think the Army and the ITBP have worked well with each other. And if there are, certain areas which can be improved in terms of coordination and, interoperability, then look at it. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, is my view.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Does anyone else have a question on the panel to your fellow panelists? Okay, so yeah, please go ahead.
Another question for Ambassador Rao. I'd be curious, given your experience on kind of the front line with these negotiations over the past 2-3 decades, have you seen any aspects of either the 22 rounds of talks or those particularly around the 93, 96, 2012 and so forth, declarations, any particular aspects that seem to work particularly well in terms of generating, I guess, bringing the Chinese closer to a response? Are there any sort of historical nuggets of hope in this process that you think might be effective moving forward?
Thank you. Well, talking of historical nuggets of hope, my recollection goes back to the period in the relationship immediately after the Rajiv Gandhi visit of 1988, where I think the level of trust, if one can call it that, however modest it might have been, was much more tangible than it was, let's say, after our nuclear tests of 1998, when there was a little period of estrangement, and then we got the relationship back on the rails. But I seriously think that period between 1988 to 1992, 1993, when we signed the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement, the first one, I think that was some kind of a period in relations between the two countries. Certainly not a Hindi-Chini bhai-bhai kind of phase, not at all. We had come through, we had been seared by the experience of 1962, and I remember how much soul-searching it took for Rajiv Gandhi to make that visit, because there was a lot of political opposition to having a summit-level visit to China. And so once that visit had succeeded to some extent in clearing the atmosphere, especially at a time when Sundaram too had escalated tension between the two countries. So the gains from that visit were considerable. And that enabled us, I think, to move forward with the setting up of the joint working group on the boundary question. And then ultimately to the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement. So that was, I think, a good phase in the relationship where we were pragmatic, we were realistic, There was no dreaminess about anybody's approach. But unfortunately, I don't think we were able to build, even though we set up the special representatives mechanism, and from 2003 onwards, we began to have those meetings of the special representatives. And after the 2005 agreement on guiding principles and political parameters for a settlement of the boundary question, which again was another watershed in the relationship, for want of a better term, I'll say watershed. And but post that, I think we've again, it's slowed down, and it's kind of, wheels grinding in the mud, literally. How do we get the traction to move forward? I think that's the point.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Deep, do you have a question, or can we continue?
No, I'm good. We can continue.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so now we come to the question and answers round, and we'll do it in such a way that these have been sent to us via email, and we have taken the liberty to identify respective panelists with the questions. And I'll first read out the questions, and then in that very order, I would request the panelists to answer. So the questions would be posed first. So this is a question to Ambassador Rao, that is there a lack of political will in China and India to solve this border issue? Is there any prospect of change in the direction from the wolf warrior diplomacy towards a more conciliatory approach if there would be a change in the Chinese leadership? Second question is to Dr. Anit. Is there a possibility that the ongoing border dispute are a handiwork of China and Pakistan to destabilize and eventually to take over some more parts of India? The next question is to Dr. Deep. It comes from George Washington University. There has been enormous media coverage. I'll just repeat. There has been enormous media coverage in India and less in China, if we compare, on the ongoing border dispute. Added to this is the enormous rising Indian nationalism. However, the Indian government seems to exhibit restraints and wants a diplomatic solution. Do you think that the Modi government is hijacked by the Indian nationalist media and the Indian military, which wants to use the crisis to raise their defense budget? And the final question is to Kylie, that since 2017, with its Indo-Pacific strategy, the US government is actively seeking cooperation with India. With this ongoing border dispute, will this push India more towards the US side? In fact, Ambassador Alice Wells has already gone on record to affirm the US commitment to stand with India in pushing back the Chinese army and to protect India's sovereignty. In fact, 3 American aircraft carrier strike groups have already been flown down to the Indo-Pacific. So your comments on this. So over to you, Ambassador Rao, if you could begin.
I think the first question was about whether the leaders of both countries have the political will to resolve the boundary question and the problems between the two sides. Well, for the last couple of decades, our leaders have met regularly. There's been a systemic, approach to leadership level contacts that we witnessed in the relationship, the growth of a strategic partnership for peace and prosperity between the two countries. So at least on the surface, political will has been expressed by both sides that India and China, being 2 large Asian countries with 4/5 of the world's population between them, that they need to settle their problems because world peace and well-being and progress and development depends on that. But the actions that you've seen in Galwan over the last few days, and the way the Chinese are, the kind of profile and the face that they are showing us in these areas would kind of, they've cast a shadow, let's say, on the relationship, on mutual confidence, on mutual trust, which is at almost at 0 level today. And that definitely has an impact on political will also. I mean, just to pick up the pieces from Galwan is going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight. But I think the fact that the diplomatic channel between the two countries continues to function would give some hope that we can de-escalate, that tension can be reduced, and that we can get back to the drawing board on how to resolve the problems between the two countries. But it's not going to be easy. The present mood, especially the public mood, is also very, very exacerbated in many ways. It's angry, and the alarm has been sounded. So it will take a little time, I think, to bring the relationship back to a base. But without political will, we can't solve this. And I think given the fact that the government of Prime Minister Modi enjoys such an overwhelming majority on the political stage in India, and also in terms of popularity and in terms of acceptance by the people of India, I think Prime Minister Modi is very well positioned to take bold decisions to settle the border between India and China. It will involve some degree of mutual adjustment and mutual concession. There's no doubt about it. No negotiation can succeed. But it takes two hands to clap, as the Chinese saying goes. And what is President Xi Jinping's attitude to this? I mean, you have a very hyper-nationalist leader there who tends to look inward, who is, there's a lot of addressing the galleries on these issues. But the fact that, the news coverage in China after Galwan, although, the Global Times and others are very shrill in their comment, but by and large, within China, I think they've tried to contain the levels of alarm and levels of concern as far as the Chinese people are concerned. The Economist wrote recently how the police guard outside the Indian embassy in Beijing is just the same as before, 4 or 5 policemen outside the Indian embassy. There's no sense that you're getting that something has gone wrong with the relationship between India and China. So there's an attempt to downplay this in China. What does it mean? Does it just is part and parcel of their very controlling way in which they handle news coverage of sensitive issues, the way the Chinese regime handles it? Or does it mean that they're still keeping a door open to negotiation and to diffusing the situation with India? I mean, the jury's out on it. So that's the question on political will. About wolf warriors, I think, that is the face of Chinese diplomacy. But, I recall, and Daniel Markey cited this in his recent book on China's Western Horizon. He says Zhou Enlai defined Chinese diplomats as members of a culturally armed People's Liberation Army. So, that's what they are. They're soft on, he said, diplomats should be soft on the outside and hard on the inside, armed with an understanding of culture and possessing loyalty to the country as well as an absolute discipline. I mean, all diplomats should be soft on the outside and hard on the outside. I think it applies to diplomats of all nationalities. But the other part about them being members of a culturally armed People's Liberation Army, I think essentially sums up what wolf warriors are like today. So it's basically, I think there was a piece, I think, written in 1995 by a Chinese analyst, and it's not my language, so I'll read it out. To screw foreigners is patriotic. That seems to be the bottom line. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Anit, would you like to go?
Thanks, Amy. I was asked whether this is a handiwork of Pakistan and China to take over parts of Ladakh. So far, I've not seen evidence of a conspiracy where they are working an active, concerted efforts to create a clash. I think the Chinese were as surprised with the events of June 15th and didn't actually expect such a strong Indian reaction, even a strong Indian deployment. In fact, they've been a bit upset and a little taken aback at how we have responded to their change of the status quo. I would have, if this was a concerted effort, then I wouldn't have seen that element. If war breaks out, then anything is on the table. So Should it be a cause of alarm? I don't think we are there yet. But is it completely out of the realm of possibility? No. Thank you.
Thank you, Anit. Deep, if you would like to go.
Quickly, Simi. So the question says that if this is an attempt by the military, and who else to raise their budget? The last part of the military, and it mentions the military and who else?
No, for the military, which wants to who wants to use the crisis to raise their defense budget, and whether the nationalist media is trying to hijack the government of India's policy of restraint.
Okay, so I'm going to take this question in two parts. The first part is about media coverage in the two countries and hyper nationalism in Indian media. Now, I'm going to argue that, excuse me, just as so in India, when we see a number of hyper-nationalist media outlets or media outlets generally cover this in a hyper-nationalist way, and we don't see that happen in China, that necessarily to me tells that there is perhaps a greater degree of control on the Chinese media that the Chinese government has, which the Indian government does not have on the Indian media, right? And that suggests not only what they cover, but also what they do not cover, right? So to see that the media has hijacked the issue, I think is not fair, is not ingenious. Can the media coverage improve, be more factual, be less hyperbole? Absolutely, there is no doubt about that. But to say that it has been hijacked by them is possibly not the fairest way of looking at this. The environment, at least in India, politically has been has allowed more nationalism over the last few years. And this is a reflection of that charged nationalistic environment, the way you see this issue being covered. That's the first one. As far as whether this has been hijacked by the military to raise their budget, I don't think, I haven't seen any evidence that would suggest that. Anit is plugged on far more into the military people. I mean, he might have views about this, but nothing I have seen seems to suggest that that is the case. Also, I'm not very certain if this is how the military in India works. I mean, there has been some literature that has talked about how the Indian military stayed away from being politicized since the early days after independence, unlike how the military has been politicized in some of our neighboring countries or some post-colonial Asian countries, etc. Though certain aspects of the military have been possibly politicized in recent years, I still don't think it's gotten to a point where they can independently operate to the point of hijacking this and create a situation like we are seeing right now with the purpose of raising their budget. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Deep. Kylie, are you there?
Yeah, so on
Kylie, please.
US-India relations, I think there's no doubt that over not just the current US administration, but really over the past 20 years, our relationship has grown much closer. I think this is true of both defense and trade more broadly. Trade since over the last 20 years has grown tenfold, and despite trade tensions, when we zoom out, the trajectory is very much a positive one, and that's also true of our strategic relationship, both as Ambassador Rao mentioned in the context of the Quad, but also bilaterally. And I would note, just in terms of the Quad, that just a few weeks ago, India signed a comprehensive strategic partnership with Australia, and I think there's very little doubt that that India is strengthening ties both with the US and other partners around the region. That said, I think it's also important, and again to echo a point that Ambassador Rao made, that India also has close relationships with Russia, particularly in terms of defense. I I'm not sure of the exact figure, but I think the majority of India's defense spendings and weapons and so forth still comes from Russia. And while it's not necessarily a Cold War era policy of non-alignment, I think there's no doubt that India will continue to be an independent player when it comes to its strategigic interests, and drawing both on the U.S., Russia, and other nations as needed.
Sure. Thank you, Kylie. With this, we come to the second set of questions, and we go in the similar order. This question is to Ambassador Rao. The border dispute comes as a very severe setback to the Sino-Indian relations, which you have also mentioned previously. But not very long back, in October 2019, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi hosted the Chinese President Xi Jinping for an informal summit at the ancient historic city of Mamallapuram. Here, the two leaders had actually agreed to deepen their contacts at the highest level to guide the future trajectory of India-China relationship. So does these Chinese misdemeanors at the border, at the LAC precisely, come as a rude shock to India's diplomatic efforts? In fact, the year 2020 was designated as the year of India-China cultural and people-to-people exchanges to mark the 70 years of diplomatic relations between India and China. Your comments on that, madam. The next question is to Dr. Anit. Is China, in all its notoriety, risking this misadventure because of India's repeated commitment to the Panchsheel Agreement? In other words, is China correct, or is it mistaken in its assessment that India would not use its military might simply because it is of no match to theirs? Or have they forgotten India's surgical strike against Pakistan? If the Chinese have mistaken India's patience as its complacency, what are the risks that it has misjudged? The next question is to Dr. Deep. Both on the Indian and the Chinese sides, there have been casualties. So, but the question is, there are contradicting claims from the Indian and the Chinese side. The Indian Ministry of External Affairs has officially stated that the Chinese side took a premeditated and planned action that was directly responsible for this bloody skirmish. And but the Chinese side blames Indians for beginning this conflict. So who is right? And given that India is long drawn battling its biggest health crisis, at the origins of which of course is China itself. So who does the Galwan Valley actually belong to? And the next question is to Kylie. There has been if you would have been observing the India's neighborhood, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and even Myanmar, they all have demonstrated affinity to China because of the economic aid, infrastructure development, military assistance, or being an all-weather friend or the guardian at the UN Security Council when cases of human rights violations or allegations of sponsoring terrorism comes up for discussion. So your comments on that? Simply because India has recently been elected as a non-permanent member at the UN Security Council for 2 years. So what are the odds for India to navigate through this at the most powerful UN agency or UN organ, with the caveat that the weaknesses of powers of being a non-permanent member? So over to you, Ambassador Rao.
Well, I think this question more or less covers what I had answered in the first question, so I don't want to repeat myself, but I think it's far too important a relationship in India's and China's relationship to be thrown away. I mean, as some suggest, what happened in Galwan was an unmitigated tragedy, but we have to look to what happens in the future in this relationship. Do we want conflict? Do we want tension? Both countries have to act in a mature and grown-up fashion and to sort out their problems. We have to study closely what went wrong in Galwan and make sure that we don't have a repeat of such tragedies again. We have to de-escalate, and I think we have to damp down emotional reactions and hysterical responses to all that has happened. We have to, as I said earlier, be clear-headed and cool and rational about how we move forward. The informal summits that Mr. Modi and Mr. Xi Jinping had in Wuhan and in Mamallapuram, they did serve their purpose. Informal summits, of course, are a very in not an unconventional way in diplomacy for leaders to reach out and create good communication and a level of confidence and ease of communication. So we shouldn't, completely sort of say that it didn't work. The relationship has underlying complexities and complications that predate any contemporary efforts that we are making. As you said, it's 70 years since we established diplomatic relations between the two countries. But don't forget what Jawaharlal Nehru said in 1952 when he was briefing or talking to the first Indian cultural delegation that was going to China. And he said that the challenge between India and China, or the kind of when two countries come up against each other like this, that challenge runs across the spine of Asia. And we often accuse Mr. Nehru of being soft on China, but I think deep down he understood the kind of the inherent complexities in this relationship. So we have to keep that in mind. We can't, as I said, forget that. But communication has to be maintained nonetheless. We may not be friends, we are adversaries. Now we call, I hear the word even enemy being used against China, but diplomacy essentially is about finding middle ground and trying to reduce tensions, and because that works for the benefit of the country, to reduce those tensions. War or conflict will not work to our benefit.
Thank you, ma'am. So if all the panelists agree, can we go on till another 20 minutes with this set of questions and the vote of thanks? Is it okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So yes, Dr. Anit, over to you.
Thank you. So I was asked about the question of whether China has forgotten the Uri strikes and has underestimated India. I don't know anything about Chinese motivations, right? Or their analysis of what was India thinking. I wouldn't know anything about that. But I do think that it might have made a misjudgment with changing the status quo as it has done, right? I do think that that perhaps either they did not think this through, or the other conclusion, and so this is an unanticipated crisis. They did not think that it would become such a big deal, that people might die on the border, and that it might create such an anti-Chinese feeling among the Indian people, and that it might be an inadvertent watershed. So that's one kind of line of thinking. Or they actually anticipated that India would do the thing it would do, but it didn't care. Right? It just did not care what would the Indians kind of respond, because they were confident enough that they would be able to take on any Indian action. In some ways, both these conclusions are a little kind of disturbing. The first, because it is misjudging India, so it does not understand India too well. The second, because if that conclusion is true, then it is just, as was said by Ambassador Rao, it's been the cowboy who enters the saloon and starts shooting and is very brazen about a challenge. And I think they're both a little kind of troubling to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Deep.
Right. So the question about the contradictory claims, right? India is saying that this was a premeditated attack from Chinese side, and China says the other thing. Now, and connected to it, who does Galwan Valley really belong to? So as Ambassador mentioned in her presentation earlier in the report of the officials of the 1961 conversation, we hear that the coordinates that were given out by the Chinese side, by the Chinese officials about where their claim lines lie, when you input them in the topography now, you find that they are further east, 3 to 4 miles further east to what they are claiming right now. So I think that by itself answers who does Galwan Valley belong to. They are right now trying to push into territory that even they did not claim in 1961, and are now they are now trying to say that no, this is what we had claimed, this is what we said is ours in 61, which, as we can see, documents prove otherwise. That's the first part of the thing. The second part is when you look at the kind of claims and counterclaims that are being made on both sides, one aspect of it is that obviously we will, when the two armies are standing eyeball to eyeball across the LOC, you will not find either side backing out at this point and saying that, okay, it was our fault, we didn't do it, you were right. So that's one part of it. But the question, the real question that you need to ask at this point is, why is it that it is China who seems to have questions or problems with territoriality with all its neighbors? I mean, you look at the South China Sea, you look at the East China Sea, you look at India. Why is it that everywhere they have to come and say that, oh, we are the victims, we were sitting peacefully, and out of the blue, everyone else, why is it that everyone else seems to have it out for China? I think that's a larger question that we need to find the answer to, or look for the answer to understand what kind of a narrative China wants to create about itself, both for its domestic audience. Please understand that it's not just for the external audience, it's not just for the world. It is also important for China to come across as a victim. It's a strange kind of duality. On one hand, they want to say that we are so powerful, we have arrived, we are ready to lead the world, and therefore, the space that the US vacates should be ours. At the same time, they want to say, oh, look at us, we are the victim, and everyone is after us. It's a strange kind of duality that is at the core of how China sees itself.
Thank you, Deep. Thank you. Kylie?
I'll pick up where Deep left off
Yes.
in terms of relations with neighbors. It strikes me that there's actually kind of an interesting parallel between at least India's relations with the permanent members of the UN Security Council and India's relations with its neighbors in SAARC in particular. There's one fairly hostile neighbor, that is Pakistan, but apart from Pakistan, India enjoys good relations with its South Asian neighbors, and I think is really seen as as the regional anchor. I think that also means that there's opportunities for that relationship to sour, and I think that I think should be seen as pushing India to be a good neighbor and to push back against some of those inroads that China has been making economically and in some cases infrastructurally. In terms of the UN Security Council, again, India enjoys good relations with the permanent members, save one, China, and I think that the same cannot be said for China, and I think that is a potential area of strength when it comes to India's position going in as a non-permanent member. I think there's an opportunity to showcase the fruits of its diplomacy, and I think that's a space where India really can have an advantage. Now, both in terms of the UN Security Council and SAARC, I think that there's also a point that needs to be made about the efficacy of these institutions, and it's not always the case that either the UN, the Security Council in particular, or more generally, or SAARC have been used effectively. But there there are examples of times when they have been really effectively used for diplomatic ends. And so I think there's some opportunities there for India.
Thank you, Kylie. Thank you. This is the end of second round. And before we move on to the vote of thanks, formal vote of thanks, there's one very popular question which has been coming up and I would like any of the panelists to take it up. That there has been a public outcry in India to ban the use of Chinese goods, and has also been supported by both members of the opposition as well as members of the ruling party. However, given the fact that China is India's biggest source of imports, with the former having a trade surplus of over $50 billion with India, what feasible steps can India take to keep out Chinese manufacturers while simultaneously conforming to the rules of the World Trade Organization? And can India really contemplate and implement an economic response against the Chinese misdemeanors along the line of actual control? So if Ambassador Rao could take it up first, and then Anit. And Deep, I think he has just suffered a power cut, but he is joining us soon. So Ambassador Rao?
I'm back, yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, it's understandable the level of public anger and concern about what has happened. But, you know, as I wrote recently for the Mint newspaper, cutting the Gordian knot, as it were, with China, given the scale of our import from that country and the levels of Chinese investment, is not as easy as you contemplate it to be or you think it to be. You've seen reports about certain, you know, important imports being held up at Chennai port because the customs was asking questions about, you know, these consignments, and the drug and pharmaceutical manufacturers have been pointing to the need for early clearance of some of these imports because they're needed, especially in the time of COVID. As you know, China is a source for active pharmaceutical ingredients that we import for a lot of our medicines. So I think we have to make our choices and our determinations based on what we need, not what the Chinese need. But I don't think we should cut our nose to spite our face, you know, at this time. We should take these decisions carefully. Where we don't need certain Chinese imports, definitely we can do away with them. And in areas of where security implications are there, where national security is involved, as in telecommunications, you've seen on the 4G issue and on 5G trials, there's already talk. I mean, I believe the government is already taking steps to rule out the participation of companies like Huawei. But in other areas, you know, there are questions of contracts, there are questions of agreements reached. We have to, of course, play this whole thing very, very carefully. But ultimately, you know, in a time when such tensions occur between countries, it's obvious that we would like to leverage some of our economic assets in a way that, vis-a-vis China, that is, that convey very clearly our concerns. But remember that China is a source of a very small, India is a very small destination for Chinese exports. It's about 3%, I think, of Chinese exports. Whereas 14%, I believe, of our imports come from China. And investment from Chinese companies in some key technology startups and in infrastructure, in manufacturing, in real estate, all that. China has come into almost every part of our society in the last few years. What I'm saying is that even though we may be doing these things with the best of intentions, it's not as easy as it seems, you know, just to cut off ties summarily with China.
Thank you. Anit, would you like to make a response to this?
No, I would agree completely along
Sure.
with Ambassador Rao. I think we should be careful about this. We should think about a dispassionate look at the cost benefit analysis. I'm not an economist, but we shouldn't do this emotional knee-jerk shut down on trade. Thank you.
Deep, your response?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with what Ambassador Rao said completely, and what Anit reiterated. Just a couple of quick points. One is that there needs to be some kind of a separation of what we consider strategic and what we don't consider strategic. That is something. If that is not a conversation, or this is not something that has happened within the various ministries of the department, now is a time when we can't avoid having this conversation anymore and making these calls, right? Once that is done, as far as the strategic aspects are concerned, as Ambassador Rao said, you obviously have to keep Chinese companies out of it, not just for economic, but also for strategic reasons. 5G, Huawei is not something I think realistically India can consider anymore. So that is done. Now, as far as the non-strategic aspect is concerned, economic activity is essentially about being able to acquire or procure raw materials, intermediate goods, and finished products from some source or the other. Now, the issue here is that India has to either be able to manufacture these things itself, or find somewhere some other supplier, some other country that is not China, which can do it at the same pace, at the same cost, at the same time. Now, till these are done, it is I think not more than rhetorical to say that let's push China out of everything. These are very practical, valid questions that have to be thought about. And after that, if replacements are possible, because even if you look at the economic figures, you'll see that whatever it is that we import from China, if you look at the second importers, they are far below. So there's a huge gap. So unless you can find a creative way of closing that gap, or you say that, okay, this is the economic cost that we have to pay, that India as a country has to pay for strategic reasons or political reasons, then that's a different question. But that conversation has to happen now.
Sure. Thank you, Marty. Kylie, would you like to respond?
To sound like a broken record, I would agree with Ambassador Rao, and I would add 2 points. One, the very obvious one, that geographically, China and India, are stuck where they are, and that produces certain kinds of realities, irrespective of trade relations. And the second one would be that even before the crisis along the line of actual control, there was the crisis of COVID and the crisis to supply chains. And I think that there is a danger for every country, and I think this has become very clear in the past few months, that an over-reliance on any one source in terms of supply chains can be very detrimental to business. So supply chain diversification, whether that means shifting to greater domestic production or diversifying sources, can be good. I mean, that's irrespective of the sort of domestic policy considerations about how to respond to China, which I would simply echo Ambassador Rao's comments on.
Sure. Thank you very much, Kylie. So now we are almost towards the end of the webinar. I now introduce to you Dr. Arjun Kumar, who has been sitting through this session very patiently. He is the Director of Impact and Policy Research Institute. He holds a PhD in economics from Jawaharlal Nehru University. He is also a China-India Visiting Scholars Fellow at Ashoka University, and he is affiliated with the Tongji University. He has deep interests in international politics, and he seeks to focus more on the convergences of international development with geopolitics. With this, I invite Dr. Kumar to ask one last question to the respected panelists and then deliver the vote of thanks. Dr. Kumar, over to you.
And thank you so much, Simi. A very exciting session, and the time is moving out. But I just have one question, because I'm also looking at the India-China relations from infrastructure and economic perspective. So my question is that does any of the panels foresee or suggest that India joins the Blue Dot network, or the Quad we just discussed, with Australia, Japan, and US, especially when India has not joined or shown any interest in the BRI projects, and also not joined the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Through this, would India's economics and infrastructure would be jeopardized? So that is the question. I would urge Ambassador Rao to take it first. And also, she very importantly mentioned that there are contentions not from now but from the last century on the aspect of spine of Asia. And that is also becoming one of the core issues. That is why I'm bringing this infrastructure and the economic question along with the trade one. So panelists, please. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Arjun. Well, I'll just be brief. I think when it comes to working with Japan and like-minded democracies and our region, to provide feasible and concrete and credible alternatives to the BRI to other countries in the region, I think is a very important choice that India should make. And I believe we've already taken steps in that direction to work with our friends and partners, especially with Japan on this Africa-Asia, I think it's called Prosperity Corridor. We're talking of a corridor between Africa, Asia, working with Japan, and exactly, addressing the need that you just mentioned. So that I think should go forward, and we bring a specific set of skills to the table, and our other friends and partners bring their own formidable skills to the table, including the United States. And we can together, I believe, craft very, very viable and workable alternatives to the BRI, because the BRI has already been shown up for various flaws and weaknesses. I need not go into that. But you're just looking at the debt burden of some of the countries, smaller developing countries who are involved in the BRI, and the whole lack of transparency and the fact that all the contracts go to Chinese companies and to Chinese. So it's a very uneven playing field. It's all about, China über alles, as they say, China over everybody. And everybody else essentially takes a secondary position in that calculus. So that's an answer to your question. The second thing, what was the second question you asked? Did you ask a second question, or was it just this?
No, just related with this.
Okay.
Dr. Anit?
Thank you. Arjun. I think, so I won't talk too much about the blue tick because I'm not really an expert on the economics of it. So I think Deep can take it on, and he actually talked about the 5G and the Huawei. But I'm going to say one thing, which is, I think this Indian straddling of strategic autonomy, of we're not really in any camp, we're not going with anyone, is actually a very cute trick. But it's not really getting us much in terms of our external balancing, right? I mean, I've heard so many of the people who engage India, whether they're Japanese or Americans or Australians or others, that the Indians are very careful about not saying anything that could potentially antagonize China. And I think that has not served India's interests well. I think because there's a very clear-cut, if there's any alliance that we can call an alliance in the post-Cold War era, it's the one between China and Pakistan. Right? And I think for us to pretend that, oh no, we are not going to, call the Quad a Quad, and we are not going to declare kind of declarations or not, align our statements, actually gets us the worst of both worlds, which is the Chinese, as it is, don't believe that we are not ganging up against them, because they would think it from a realist perspective. They'd say, why aren't you doing it? Right? They have done it in the past. Why is India so shy to actually say that, look, we do share apprehensions about China's expansionist mindset. We are seeing it across the world. We have seen it in the South China Sea. There are countries in Southeast Asia that are concerned about it. And all they hear from the Indians are, well, we can't turn up for Shangri-La dialogue. We cannot come for this. We are all under the UN flag. Well, the UN flag is decided by the P5. And guess who's a part of the P5? Not India. So we are basically saying our military would be deployed only when China approves it. What does that tell you about us? Right? I think we really need to get out of the straitjacket of, we should not upset the Chinese because they don't care. That's my personal opinion on this. So I think in terms of so it's not about putting all your eggs in one basket. It's not just about we are only going to work. We should work with anybody who shares the same interests. It's not about the country. It's basically about the alignment of interests. Whether the interests align with France or with America or with Russia at times. And I think India does expect that in the long run, the China partnership with the Moscow actually would not pan out. So I think it does not serve India's interest to actually play this game so cutely. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Deepal. Yes.
Yeah. Quick short.
Just one word. Listening to Anit, I'm reminded of that line from Charles Dickens's David Copperfield, where Clara, the character in David Copperfield, the constant advice to her is, Clara, be firm. I think we have to do that. That applies to India too.
Before I answer this, I must say I never thought that either strategic autonomy would be called cute or India-China relations. The answer to India-China relations was in David Copperfield. So this has been a very enlightening session for me personally. Now going on to the question of the Blue Dot Network, I'm going to take a 35,000 feet view like Anit did. Where India is now, one of the major policy steps that will have to be there going from here will involve external balancing, right? And whatever kind of tools that India needs to employ, or whatever kind of various architectures that India needs to look at for this, is it the Quad Plus? Is it a military element to the Quad? Is it the Blue Dot Network? Is it something else? I think all of these, it's time now that we approach all of these with a very open mind. And my sense is that India will also find a lot of willing partners or members in these architectures, because as we were talking about earlier, there are a vast number of countries that are feeling quite jittery about the way China has been behaving in at least for most of this year, both in terms of the kind of pin tricks and salami slicing and all of that we are seeing, but also in terms of how China dealt with the entire coronavirus issue, misdirected, misinformed, and obfuscated initially, and then through wolf warrior diplomacy tried to make people shut up and not talk about when they try to bring about when they try to pin the culpability on China. So I think India will good policy making would involve India looking at all of these various opportunities or options as they may present themselves.
Sure. Dr. Kylie, if you'd like to make a just brief response, so that we can just
I would only echo Deep's last point, that I think this is there are potentially effective multilateral institutions that have been developed that can be used and leveraged for India's strategic and economic interests. And I think that there's particularly given I think rising assertiveness on the part of China, and the kind of global response that particularly from democratic countries that it's received. I think now is a particularly good time for India to take advantage of these multilateral institutions. I think the Blue Dot Network, the Quad, these are obviously good ones, and as I mentioned earlier, with the strategic partnership signed with Australia, I think it's clear that India is to some extent already taking these steps.
Thank you all respected panelists. Arjun, if you'd like to just deliver the vote of thanks briefly, and then we'll
Yes, Simi, thank you everyone for a very interesting and enlightening session on today's panel discussion, and which we extended for almost more than half an hour. I thank all of you for being part of our international webinar on border disputes in Sino-Indian relations, past, present, and prospect. I would like to thank our panelists, Ambassador Nirupama Rao, thank you, ma'am. Dr. Anit Mukherjee, thank you, sir. Dr. Deep Pal, thank you. And most importantly, Dr. Kyle Gardner, who has joined from US on the first day of the week, very early in the morning. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Sigur Center for Asian Studies at George Washington University at Washington, DC, and also its director, Professor Benjamin Hopkins, for this unwavering support in this collaborative exercise. It has been very enlightening holding this discussion, and I would just like to conclude by saying that the relation of India and China dates back to 2 centuries at least before BC, before Christ. And India, China, both the countries have ancient civilization. Both are largest developing countries and also are emerging economies. And their relation, India's and China's relation, is also relevant for regional and global significance and strategy and how we move forward in this century. This century is, as also our panelists highlighted, China is saying it's China's century. The world has also acknowledged that it's century of Asia. And so how we are moving in this relation about our friendship, about our increased mutual cooperation and expanding our cooperation based on the values of also from our the father of India, Mahatma Gandhi, holding these values of peace and non-violence. And lastly, I would say that we pray for well-being and progress of India and China, their friendship and health and happiness of everyone around the globe. Thank you. Have a very nice evening.
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Kumar. Before we sign off, can I just request all the panelists to turn on their videos so that I can take a quick screenshot as a group photograph? Yeah. 1, 2, 3, go. 1, 2, 3, go. Thank you so much. Thank you and have a very good evening. Thank you all for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.